Good morning to our audience from London, South East and around the world. I'm very grateful today and actually really quite humbled to have someone who doesn't just sing from the same hymn sheet, but wrote quite a few of the hymns. As we do advisory work at Bonas MacFarlane. My name's Charles Bonas. But it really is quite something to be with a man who is probably more knowledgeable than anybody else about what we got to talk about today, because Barnaby, in four guises, if I could just give them a little recap. I'm afraid the more senior you are, the longer the introduction becomes. As a geography teacher, he's still quite renowned, and not just because he wrote textbooks, but people come to me in their 40s and 50s and say, well, that Barnaby Lenon really taught me something. And even frankly, if you logged into the wrong webinar this morning and not interested in schools, you should listen to Barnaby, because he has this great gift of clarifying very complex and simplifying complex matters into a story. And I've heard many of his speeches and talks, and he's one of the great clear minds I've ever come across. Secondly, in his guise as a headmaster of Trinity Croydon and at Harrow, where I got to know him a little bit, really sorting Harrow out is what Barnaby did. And for the first time in several hundred years, I think one could say that it's no longer the case that the best thing at Harrow is that you can see Eton on a clear day. He then left Harrow to do two very interesting things. First, he's a social entrepreneur, as one of the founders of the London Academy of Excellence, and then as a trustee of the New Schools Network. And then as a scholar, we are talking to Professor Lenon, the Dean of Education at University of Buckingham. Palace investitures have also featured this year, where Barnaby being honoured with a CBE for his services to education. Barnaby, tell me a little bit about your work in the last few years researching what makes good schools. You've got two very interesting books, one much promised successful schools in England, and the other people's children, which we'll come back to in a minute. But how have you really changed your mindset about independent schools through looking at it through the prism of the state sector?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Yeah, so one of the things that slightly irritated me was that every year the league tables came out. Some of you will have no doubt have read the Sunday Times league tables. And occasionally there was quite an intelligent league table which ranked schools by the amount of progress their pupils made rather than just their raw exam results. But nowhere could I find anyone who explained why schools that got very good results got them. And in particular, no one could explain to me why state schools which had particularly large numbers of disadvantaged children, that is children on free school meals, some of them were able to get incredible progress 8 schools, in other words, tremendous progress between the ages of 11 and 16. So I went and visited a lot of these schools and wrote my book. And what I discovered was that these schools all had plenty of things in common, and I agreed basically with everything they did. It was things that I'd been trying to do throughout my teaching career. And here they were being successfully implemented in a number of state schools, not least in London, actually. And so I did that very enjoyable piece of work. But then I realized that there was still one huge gap in my knowledge, and that is what happens to the pupils in this country who do relatively badly at GCSE. Where do they go? And that's about half the pupils, those who don't go on to do A-levels. And teachers, both in independent schools and state schools, don't really know much about what happens to them. It's half the population. So that's why I wrote my second book, Other People's Children, to describe precisely what does happen to them.
Thank you, Barnaby. And we're going to talk for about 50 minutes. And then we've had some very interesting questions that have already been put to us. And do please give us any more questions as you go along. The whole school selection business, really, people get very stressed about it, don't they? I mean, we'd like you to sort of navigate us through in the next 3/4 of an hour or so. Where would you start?
Okay, well, I would start by saying that it's wrong to get unduly anxious about it. In the end, perhaps your choice of school doesn't matter as much as you think it does, and all children eventually get placed in a school, and in most cases, it turns out to be a good choice for them. But I would start by saying that there are just a number of fundamental decisions that all parents have to make. They have to decide ultimately whether they're going to go for a private fee charging school or a state school. And that's a decision which, remember, you can start thinking about when a child is very young, but you don't have to make that decision firmly and finally until just a few months before they're due to go to the school. But you've got to make that decision. Are you interested, if you're thinking about particularly an independent school, are you interested in day or boarding? Are you keen for your child to go to a co-educational school, or would you much rather they went to single sex? Are you thinking about the location of the school? One of the things I don't really like is when parents send their children to a day school which is a long way away from where they live. It's just cruel and unnecessary to require your child to spend 2 to 4 hours a day traveling to and from school. So one needs to think about that. Are you going to move house perhaps in order to be close to a school that you really favour for your children? And I think another important question is, do you want to go for a school which is very academically selective or not? Obviously, the schools that are very academically selective are going to be at the top of any league tables you're interested in. And inevitably, those very selective schools get very good results. But I think most parents would agree with me that it's not a great thing for your child to be forced through cramming, into a very academically selective school, and then find themselves right at the bottom of that school. One of my daughters, for example, we got her into a very academically selective girls' school, North London Collegiate School, which was the most amazing school. And in fact, my older daughter became head girl there and absolutely thrived. But eventually, we decided to move my younger daughter, because she was always going to be in the bottom quartile in that very selective school. And we moved her to a school which was much less selective. And she actually did, I would say, better academically going to that slightly less selective school, because it gave her confidence. She knew that she was no longer in the bottom quarter. In fact, she was probably in the top quarter in that school. And that confidence made a big difference to her. So that's an important question. How academically selective do you want to be? The things that, if I could just finish on that, the things that I wouldn't personally attach too much importance to, I don't think, I know a lot of parents agonize over co-ed or single sex. I don't personally think that that has a huge bearing on the quality of a school. And finally, I think that if you choose a school just because you like the head teacher, that's always dangerous, because that head teacher, if they're really good, are probably going to leave. And then that produces a sense of disappointment. So don't attach too much importance to the head teacher. So those are the kind of the basic decisions. And of course, your child is most unlikely to go to the same school from the age of, let's say, 2 to 18. So it's a decision that you may have to revisit from time to time, depending on your personal circumstances. Age 2, what nursery, age 5, what prep school or primary school, or age 7 for some prep schools, aged 11 for some senior school, age 13 for some other senior schools, age 16 for the sixth form. These are all points at which these decisions that I've just described can be rethought.
Is it what really interests me about some of your work is the emphasis on good teaching, and you as a teacher, there was a rumor that you prepared all your lessons, the whole year worth of lessons in advance, and you're clearly a very organised, structured and brilliant teacher, but you've gone on record as saying that teaching is good in the sense that most people don't realise that the outcomes are not so much about the school choice of schools as far as what happens within a school itself. The teaching quality within a school is absolutely vital. How does one evaluate that in a school? Obviously, you've got league tables. The school's top of the league tables. It follows that all the teaching is going to be good, or does it? How does one go to a school and really assess the teaching quality?
Okay, so you can't judge it by the league tables. I mean, I've taught at and been involved with some schools that are near the top of the league tables, and that they all have some quite bad teachers in them. I would start with the school inspection report. Remember, every school is inspected every 3 or 4 years. And if it's an independent school, it'll be on the Independent Schools Inspectorate website. And if it's a state school, it'll be on the Ofsted website. But, you know, a school inspection does look at quite a lot of teaching. And so that's not a bad place to begin. Secondly, I think that if you're talking about a secondary school, it's a good idea to try and get hold of the exam results by subject. The exam results by subject tell you quite a lot, and you'll see that even in a school that's near the top of the league tables, you know, the results that they get in different subjects can vary a bit. I always think that's quite interesting. It provides you something to talk about if you're going for an open day. And beyond that, I think you're likely to want to talk to other parents who can tell you. But does it? I don't know whether it really helps you that much in terms of choosing a school, because obviously the teaching workforce changes so much, probably 10% at least every year, and you don't know which teachers your particular child is going to get. And you know, in a small prep school, let's say, there may only be 2 or 3 teachers teaching one particular year group, and let's say 2 of them are good and 1 is not so good. You can't control that. The head teacher is going to assign your pupil to a particular teacher, whether you like it or not. But yeah, I mean, obviously you can go to the best school in the world, but if you have a bad teacher, you've wasted your money. You can go to the most expensive boarding school in the United Kingdom, but if you have a bad house parent, you perhaps could be wasting your money. So it is quite an important question.
Like, coming back to your point about lots of coaching and cramming to get into a senior school, I despite the fact that we have a tutoring service, I'm very anti that. But yeah, the curious thing I find that in nearly 28 years of tutoring children, I've never come across a single child who's got into a high academic threshold senior school and has had to leave because of purely academic reasons. So is it the case possibly that some prep school heads feel that a child isn't suited to a senior school, and they're writing a reference after all, because they forget that children have this rather bad habit of becoming teenagers, or some peak quite early? I mean, you were quite instrumental in the year 7 and what's now become a year 6 pre-test at Harrow, but you're not actually testing boys the few months before they arrive at the school. So what's your view there?
Well, I think that if a school accepts a pupil, having maybe gone through a battery of entry tests, then they have a responsibility to keep that pupil and look after them. And I don't really approve of schools that kick pupils out because, let's say, their GCSE results aren't amazing before they get into the 6th form. And I think most heads would agree with me. So if your child gets into an academically selective school, they'll probably be okay there. But what I'm saying is that I would not want my child to have squeezed into a highly academic school and then always be jumping along the bottom. Because, you know, my daughter at North London Collegiate got the impression that she was quite dim because she was with such brilliant girls. In fact, the truth is she's a good average. But she couldn't see that, and it just helped her moving to a school which had a slightly wider ability range. On the other hand, my highly intelligent older daughter benefited hugely from going to a school where she did not stand out, actually, as being particularly clever. And, you know, I'm always, you know, extremely grateful that she was with a cohort of girls who were able to give her a good run for her money. So I think my main point is, you know, you're going to be interested in the league tables, but don't be too interested.
I think you're absolutely right, and I find that many students, including me many years ago, actually work much better in a second class in a year, or the third class, because the way they process information, and they need things to be presented in a more methodical, clear way. What do you think the way to look at schools is now with these virtual tours? One of the questions, a few of the questions actually brought this up. You know, it's very difficult, isn't it, when you can't actually physically get into a school to try and select one?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, many parents go on open days years before their child is due to actually go to the school. And live open days are obviously going to start again probably this summer. So you'll have another opportunity, if you're not satisfied with the virtual tour, to go and visit the school. I mean, I think, you know, virtual tours are the only option at the moment, but they're very unsatisfactory for parents. You wouldn't, I don't think, choose a school on the basis of a virtual tour. It's going to be highly selective, and anyway, you need to be able to chat openly with maybe other parents who are there and with the staff. Surely that opportunity is coming along in the near future.
And coming back to this academic selection, really, what's the advantage of having a very academically selective school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are definitely 2 or 3 advantages. So one I've already mentioned, and that is, I think it's very good if you're a very clever boy or girl to be surrounded by other pupils who are as able as you, just basically to maintain the right level of humility. And I would say also, you know, they provide competition, and competition is a good thing. But if you're the cleverest child by miles in your school, you're not going to have that competition. So I think that's one reason. Secondly, let me just finish my list. Secondly, I think that in terms of something like preparing for entry to a top university like Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, you get economies of scale in a school which has a large number of Oxbridge applicants like Westminster or St Paul's. You get economies of scale. So rather than being the only girl applying to read history at Oxford, you're one of 4 or 5. And that makes it much more likely that the lessons are going to be interesting, challenging, and you're going to be part of a group. So I think that's a good thing. And thirdly, I think that very academically selective schools will be trying to appoint staff who are able to teach very clever children, who themselves have a stellar academic record. So you have the benefit of those people working in your school. I mean, you know, if you went to any of the highly academically selective schools, you'd find that there were a large number of teachers who went to Oxford and Cambridge as pupils themselves. Good thing.
So that's all very true, but I really want to bed down this question, because it's very frustrating where parents just think the best schools are the schools that come highest in the rankings. And if you look at the Sunday Times Parent Power, all it evaluates is the ranking of a school according to its grades. But taking those points, if you're a school, say, of 700 or 800 students, and you're academically relatively selective, but you're also taking in children with special educational needs, children who are good at sport, children who are late developers, whatever. So it's a broad-ranging school. So it's not Westminster, but it might be a really good provincial day boarding school. It might be one of the less well-known London schools. If your set of students, your fellow students, are in a top set or even in the second set, say, are all heading towards Oxbridge, Imperial College, top Russell Group universities, top American universities, etc. Does it really matter that you've got a series of divisions lower down the school where you don't have academic children? And surely with a school that size, who's getting, say, 20 or 30 students in STEM subjects and in humanities subjects into Oxbridge, all of your criteria are met.
I quite agree. So what we're saying is, okay, let's just start with the Sunday Times league tables, say. So the Sunday Times league tables, and indeed the aspects of the Department for Education league tables, both of which are worth looking at, but they are based on raw results, not the progress that the pupils have made. And I can say categorically that schools that are some way down the league tables are getting results relative to the ability of the pupils which are just as good as the schools that are at the very top of the league tables. Their teaching is just as good. Let me just dwell on league tables for one moment. So the Sunday Times raw results only, and the prep schools that are in there are the schools which took SATs at the age of 11, and that's, I believe, about 15% of prep schools. So most prep schools don't even get a look on that league table, which therefore has to be described as completely useless. Now, the Department for Education league tables are better because they include progress data. But unfortunately, because most children who go to an independent senior school have not taken SATs, they don't get a progress score for their GCSEs, but they would get a progress score for A-level. So that's worth looking at, actually. And it's certainly worth looking at if you're thinking about going to a state school, because it's progress that matters, remember. These schools at the top of the league tables, the reason they're at the top of the league tables is not only that they have good teaching, but it's mainly because they take very able pupils, and quite honestly, even if the teachers were pretty weak, those pupils get very good exam results. So you have to be quite wary of the league tables. That's why I started this talk by saying, have a look at the inspection report and don't attach too much importance to the league tables. I would also want to have a look. I would want to have a look for every school at their university entry data, just to confirm the point you just made, Charles, which is, if your child is quite bright, you'd want to find that the school had got a good record of entry to Russell Group universities and Oxford and Cambridge, and that university entry data should be readily available to you.
And if it's not, many schools show that data on their website. We just had an interesting question about where you can access the school results subject by subject. You can always ask a school for that sort of information, can't you?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
So I think what you do first of all is dig down in the website. A lot of schools do put their subject by subject results on their website, and if they don't, I think that's a mistake, actually, and slightly worrying. But it's perfectly all right to ask the school for that data. Obviously, they've got it, and if they're not giving it to you, you might ask them why.
Then just finally on this, do you think there's any merit in the sort of what I call the big fish, small pond argument, where if you're at a slightly less academic selective school or noticeably less academically selective school, you might be the only standout candidate for Cambridge maths admission that year. Whereas if you're at one of the top London academic schools, I say top in terms of selectivity, you might be in a group of 10. Is that going to reflect possibly on your reference? Do you have more of a chance of a reference that says this is the best student we've seen at the school for years?
Well, I think possibly. There is something in that. And certainly I have heard quite well-informed people say that you stand more chance of getting into Oxford and Cambridge if you go to a slightly less selective school than one that's in the top 5. But on the other hand, I've already made the point that those that are in the top 5 are very good at Oxford and Cambridge entry. They have a good track record. But it's certainly the case that if you're the only pupil applying for a particular subject in your school, you should get really good attention. But I mean, that's not a given. That's not a given, is it?
Yeah, and since we're talking about Oxford, it's a really serious problem, isn't it? This for the independent sector, the contextual admissions. What's your view on that? Do you think it's overemphasised by schools and students as an excuse for not giving adequate Oxbridge preparation or just not getting in? Or is it really true? And I know for a fact that it's true in lots of areas, but I'd like to hear your view on it.
Okay, well, there are two or three things you can say about that. First of all, this is not a new issue. I mean, I dare say we've been debating this for 20 years, and universities have been required to set admissions targets for about 20 years, and those admissions targets include trying to increase the proportion of their students who come from state schools. Secondly, in the case of Oxford and Cambridge, the main issue there actually has not been the universities trying to take more students from state schools, because they haven't succeeded, particularly in terms of actual numbers. The main issue has been a great increase in the number of overseas students that they've taken who pay higher fees, and that has displaced both independent and state school pupils from Oxford and Cambridge in the last certainly 6 or 7 years. All the statistics are on the Oxford and Cambridge admissions website, so you can see this for yourself. Thirdly, we do a survey every year asking independent schools how they feel their Oxford and Cambridge admission has gone. And what they all say is that the average pupils who might have got in the past now don't get in, but their best pupils continue to get in. And on the whole, they think that's quite reasonable.
I remember you saying that, actually, and it is concerning, though. If you see the letters that come back from Oxford colleges, they're very open about this. They will say, well, actually, you've got 7 A stars or 7 sevens in your GCSE. We have a contextual admissions policy which would say that if you'd gone to a state school, we'd have seen that as a very strong result. Whereas because you're at this particular independent school, we expect you to get 11 A stars. Are those the sort of relatively middling ability candidates you were talking about who are not getting in? That's
exactly it. That is the group. It's those who have got 6, 7, or even 8 A stars at GCSE are not getting in. And incidentally, the other thing that's happened is that some state schools have now become very good at getting outstanding A-level results and preparing students for Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, you know, I was the chairman of governors of the London Academy of Excellence in the East End of London for 10 years. This year, this October, we sent 33 students to Oxford and Cambridge and a similar number to medical school. Now, that's a far better record than most independent schools.
That's out of how many applicants? What's that as a percentage?
So there's 250 in the year group, and let's say 100 applied and 33 got in. That's quite a good number. Now, there aren't many schools, state schools like that, but there's a growing number. And that's quite right. I mean, you know, why shouldn't they? I mean, we have, you know, my school, we have 3,000 applicants for 250 places. They've all got a string of A stars at GCSE. Of course, a good number of them should get in.
And you're chairman of the governors, or are you a governor? I can't quite remember, of the King Edward VI schools in Birmingham. And do you feel that there's a big difference between those sort of old, really powerful grammar schools and some of what we still refer to as public schools?
No. I mean, there is a big difference, but not in terms of academic results or university entry. There's no significant difference. I mean, the 2 King Edward schools, private schools in Birmingham, get very, very good results and you know, reasonable numbers into Oxford and Cambridge. No, the big difference. I mean, you've just used the word public schools, which is a rather old-fashioned word, but let's imagine that you mean the well-known boarding schools. And there is a big difference between day schools and boarding schools of any type, because boarding schools just have so much more time available to them, and therefore so much more opportunity to do activities outside the classroom. That is the main characteristic of a boarding school.
It's interesting actually, because people are increasingly, in my experience, using the word public school, having seen it as being rather sort of almost politically incorrect a while ago. I suppose it refers back to the Public Schools Act. But another difference actually is the difference, maybe you can help with this, the difference between a teacher and a schoolmaster. What would you say that is?
Yeah, no, there's no difference between a teacher and a schoolmaster or a schoolmistress.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, obviously some schools still use the word master, even for women teachers, but it means nothing.
So we're coming on now to sort of boarding and the roundedness of an independent school education. What you're effectively saying is that if you're a good, strong, middling ability student, even though it might decrease your chances of getting into Oxbridge, it's probably still worth going to one of these really good independent schools because of the variety of activity and the roundedness of character, etc. And at boarding schools, there's much more time, as you say, and there's more of an academic and educational community for that to flourish.
Right. So first of all, I need to correct you. It doesn't decrease your opportunities of getting into Oxford and Cambridge if you go to one of those schools.
Why? I thought we said that it does.
No, it doesn't. No. It doesn't.
Well, unless you get, say, a clear run of grade 9s in your GCSEs, it does.
No. What we've said is that if a child goes to a school with a relatively weak academic record, they will be admitted on lower GCSE and A-level grades than someone who goes to a school with a high academic record. That's what universities mean by contextual admissions. And that seems to be perfectly fair and reasonable, in the same way, frankly, as a school like Eton might make it a lot easier for a child who's come straight out of a state school applying for a scholarship, let's say, to Eton, than someone who's been in an expensive prep school for many years. So that's the difference. But the point is that quite large numbers of pupils are still getting into Oxford and Cambridge, and even more, of course, into the Russell Group from independent schools. It's just that to get into the very top universities, you've got to have very good GCSE and A-level predictions, and you're more likely to get those in an independent school than in a state school, than in most state schools. But so that's the first. That's just correcting you on that. No, but going back to your point, why would you go to a boarding school particularly? Well, because the extra time means that you have an opportunity to do this very wide range of extracurricular activities. You could do sport, for example, 7 days a week. I mean, if you're a musician, the number of performance opportunities will be probably 4 or 5 times as many as in any day school. So that's, and the reason all of that is important is because these extracurricular activities are increasingly seen as the thing which can make a big difference to a person's life. That because they provide them with, let's call it the soft skills, how to work in a team, how to lead things, that in the end seem to matter so much. They matter more ultimately than academic results. And also these extracurricular, co-curricular activities like drama and art and music and societies, the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, Cadet Force, all of those things lead for many students to lifelong interests and have a great, significance to, when I talk now to pupils that I taught 40 years ago, it's very often these activities that they did outside the classroom that have had the greatest impact on their lives. And I think also that anyone who's been to a boarding school would say that they made friends for life there, and that friends for life is much more likely to happen in a boarding school than a day school. I don't want to overstate that, but I mean, there are, for the right sort of pupil, great advantages.
Can I move on to something rather different? But by the way, I'm still not entirely with you on this contextual admissions, but we might need to leave that story for another day. But the powerful point to make about the independent sector is that it does really open up this extraordinary co-curricular potential for students. We've had some interesting questions about special educational needs provision from children on a very mild end of spectrums to quite severe. How does one go about finding a school that's really going to address identify special educational need?
Well, they should be pretty self-evident, to be honest, because on the whole, they advertise themselves as either being a school which specialises in special needs children, or a school which has quite a lot of provision for special needs pupils. So, you know, it's not difficult to find that list. And remember that a high proportion of all the schools in the country that have special provision for special needs are independent schools, and some of the pupils in those schools are paid for by the local authority. So they have a mixture of fee paying and non-fee paying. But special needs is, it's one of the areas, if you like, where the independent sector fills the gap that has been left by slightly inadequate state provision.
Yeah, I mean, do you think educational psychologist report is probably the best starting point to go from? I mean, this is something we find that is not really used enough, that you're only sent to an educational psychologist if someone thinks you're dyslexic or you're not very clever. Isn't it preferable to do sort of deeper assessments in terms of finding the right school for your child? And that's really the parents' responsibility as much as the schools, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It is. I mean, I think that parents, first of all, it's very important that parents shouldn't make too much of this and give the impression to their child that there's something wrong with them. But, let's remember that a very, very large number of pupils do get ed-psych reports. And the good thing about having an ed-psych report is that that it enables you to ask the right questions of the schools that you're thinking of sending your child to. So if your child is diagnosed as being dyslexic, then you need to be sure that the school you're sending your child to has a specialist dyslexic tutor who can help. And incidentally, that could be quite an academically selective school. I mean, one would hope that all schools, but including those that are academically selective these days, will be able to provide extra support for dyslexia, to take just one example.
Just on that theme, do you think parents expect too much of schools? Is this possibly why there's this national sort of middle class obsession about where one's child goes to school? Is it the case that we've seen this vast increase in supplementary education offerings, such as tutoring, over the last 20 years? You make the very powerful point that you can be in what's deemed to be a very good school but not have the right teachers. Where do you think schools are going? Do you think they'll still be around in a few hundred years' time?
Well, I think you might have asked more than one question there, but so do parents fuss too much about the school? Yes, I think they do, because I think they overstate the importance of a school to the eventual nature of your child and even their exam results. Will schools still be around? Yeah, I mean, schools of course will still be around, but I think if you ask me not about the next 300 years, but let's say the next 20 years, I feel that there will be a growing emphasis on non-academic skills, because I think that this country has moved to a very sort of hardline academic GCSE based system in the last 20 years. It wasn't like that before. I mean, when I started teaching in 1977, and I taught at Eton for 12 years, and Eton in those days was a fully comprehensive school, because pretty well all the pupils had to be put down for entry to the school before they were aged 1. So the children were selected before they could be obviously selected on any rational basis. So it was a very wide ability range. And in those days, for that reason, quite a number of the pupils did not get particularly good A-level results and didn't go on to university. Many went into the army, some went straight into a job, but you know, they didn't go to university. Nobody batted an eyelid. There was no thought that, you know, that somebody who wasn't particularly academic should try to get to university. Now there is an assumption that everyone should go to university, and indeed over half do. And everything has been reduced down to exam results. But we know that there's much more to life than exam results, and we know that, you know, certainly when I talk to my former pupils in their 40s and 50s, their exam results helped them in some ways. It helped them to get to a good university, which may well have helped them get their first job. That can't be denied. But their progress thereafter was dependent on their soft skills, not, for goodness sake, their geography GCSE grade, but, you know, the extent to which they were able to speak in public, manage other people, be a pleasant but effective person in the office, and so on. Be able to withstand knockbacks and adversity, all of those kind of personal characteristics which independent schools already take a lot of interest in, and I think that all schools will take an increasing interest in over time. It's just we've got to get away from an obsession with exam results and league tables.
So, I mean, I mentioned a long time frame because it's been so fascinating with this pandemic to see how online education, online schooling, homeschooling has just accelerated beyond any kind of expectation. Do you have any remarks on that?
Yeah, I think on the whole, learning online is pretty hateful. And it's interesting that here in Oxford, where I'm sitting today, the Higher Education Policy Institute, that does research on behalf of universities, did a survey a few weeks ago, and they asked university students, all of whom of course are learning online, what's your best form of teaching and what's your worst form of teaching? And the best form of teaching was always with a tutor, in a proper lecture theatre, and the worst was always, you know, an online seminar, an online lecture. Look, online teaching has been a great way to fill a gap, but there are loads of problems with it. I mean, lots of pupils, particularly younger pupils, just can't concentrate and, you know, just haven't really benefited from it at all. There's been no pastoral care. It's very hard for the teachers to assess pupils' progress when they're sitting at home behind a computer. So some children have fallen behind, you know, without really the teacher knowing it. And I'm sure it will play an increased role, particularly maybe through assessing and management of homework, that kind of thing. But the idea that, you know, online teaching has been so successful that classroom teaching is finished is just a total myth.
Interesting. Just coming back to these wretched league tables, I'm so sorry to keep going on about this, but it is the crux of so much of the choices that parents are making, is that they're saying that this school is the top school, it's the best school because it gets on these league tables. If you had your time again, would you have wanted Harrow to be on the league tables? Because you know, part of your headmastership there saw the school going so higher up the rankings, and that was in part your doing. But why publicise it so much?
Yeah. Okay, so obviously, if you're a school that needs to recruit able pupils, it's a great advantage to appear in a league table as a way of demonstrating that you do very well with able pupils and you come high in the league tables. At Harrow, when I started, the school was quite low in the league tables, but I was able to get through the University of Durham progress data, which showed that actually at Harrow, pupils were making more progress than in most other schools. And I found when I spoke to my prospective parents on open days, they completely understood that we were a school that preferred not to be as academically selective as, let's say, Winchester, but that our results, individual by individual, were going to be just as good as Winchester or any other school, and the progress data, what's called at A-level, the ALIS data, ALIS data, which many, many schools have, showed that my pupils were getting results which were better than they would get in most other schools. Now today, let me say, Harrow is one of many schools that have withdrawn from the league tables. You won't find them anywhere in the Sunday Times supplement from last weekend. And that's true of quite a number of schools because they just don't like the message that is sent by league tables. And certainly, you know, at Harrow, I always took quite a number of pupils every year who weren't particularly good academically, but had something else to offer the school. Maybe they were very good at sport, or they were you know, already grade 5 or 6 on a musical instrument. And you know, in the context of a boarding school, those things were just as important as the academic results.
Can one access this ALIS data and the value-added information about schools, this data, as a parent?
No, you can get the A-level value-added from the Department for Education table. The ALIS data, and there's another set of data used in many schools called ALPS, ALPS, is not in the public domain, but if you ask the school, they'll tell you whether they've got it.
You're quite a traditionalist in your views of teaching, and we'll send it round to everybody afterwards, but I thought there's an excellent sort of synopsis that you gave of your view on what makes teaching really successful, and this was from your research in state schools, and it's from the Times blog, I think, in 2017, relating to your book, other much promised successful schools in England. Just give us a very sort of condensed version of the condensed version. What makes for strong teaching that's really effective?
Okay, so I mean, I've just mentioned 3 or 4 things that I think are very important. I think first of all, good subject knowledge matters quite a lot, particularly, but not only actually in a secondary school, in a senior school. The teachers who know most tend to be the most interesting teachers, actually, and are likely to be more effective. Secondly, you've got to be someone who can maintain good control of your class. Now that may seem unnecessary actually, but it's not unnecessary. Even in independent schools, pupils misbehave, and you need therefore to be a teacher who can be, you know, authentically fierce and control your class well, while being inside a warm and humane person, and eventually the pupils will come to learn that you're warm and humane. It's just that it may not happen in the first lesson. Thirdly, you need to know what works in a classroom and what doesn't. You know, and that comes a bit with experience, and you know, that's why very often the best teachers are slightly older, because they've grasped, you know, when is it a good idea to make a joke, when is it a good idea to ask a question, when is it a good idea just to sit silently while pupils are working. So I think that you know, I think there are other things that make for good teachers. I think they have to be, you know, very organised. I think they have to be hard-working. And I think above all, perhaps they have to have very high expectations of their class. I mean, I always set out to ensure that my class did better than other classes. In other words, I was highly competitive on their behalf. And above all, you know, all teachers have to pay particular attention to the weakest pupils in their group, because that's the challenge. I mean, I think I've already suggested this morning that anyone can get good results with a clever pupil, to be honest, but it's with the lazy or the slightly less intelligent pupil, that's where the teacher earns his or her money by showing a particular interest in them and, you know, driving them forward, using a range of sticks and carrots to get them to get to a higher place than they would have been otherwise. So good teachers care, in other words, they care about the individual pupils that they're teaching.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, those criteria will probably still be the same in 300 years' time. I mean, in that sense, exactly. Yeah. just coming back to a few quick questions which are very important, but they're really quite common, which have been asked us. So we're very grateful for your view on them. When's a good time to move school? Because you've got these different entry points. So we're being asked, should I move my child in year 6 or year 9? And you make the point that a third of children at boarding school are actually in the 6th form, and that there's quite a lot of moving now that goes on at that stage.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so obviously there are some prep schools where you can leave either at the age of 11 or 13. And the prep schools will normally try and battle to keep your child there until they're 13, because otherwise they're going to, they're just going to have rather small classes, not very economic from their point of view. But I think as a parent, you've just got to make your own decision. And many hundreds of parents I've known have applied for a school at 11, and if they get in, let's say they apply to a local grammar school, and if they get in at the age of 11, then they take that place. But if they don't, they stay till they're 13, and then try this time for an independent school. That's quite common. Yeah, a lot of pupils, I mean, in the country as a whole, over 60% of pupils change school at the age of 16. It's a much lower proportion within independent schools, but nevertheless, a lot of young people start boarding at the age of 16, and no doubt their parents think that's because it's a good preparation for university. There are all sorts of good experiences that can be had in the 6th form, which are more available in a boarding school. So a third of all the boarders in independent schools in this country are in the 6th form. That's quite an important figure. So the other really important decision that I deal with a lot in the independent sector is girls wanting to leave single-sex girls' school at the age of 16 to go to a co-ed school. And again, that's a great battle that's fought every year by the single-sex girls' schools to try and keep the girls in their school at the age of 16. And there are, strong arguments for and against.
Yeah, so that's where quite a lot of the sort of strategic thinking comes in, I guess. We're beginning to start running out of time. There are a few more really important things we want to touch on. Bursaries. Yeah.
So there are things called scholarships, which are a reward for excellence, academic, music, sport sometimes. And there are things called bursaries, which are meant to be means tested and are for those who couldn't otherwise afford the fees. Very often, a bursary has a sort of kind of scholarship element to it, because the bursaries are only given to pupils who are very good academically, or good at music, or good at sport. Over the last 20 years, the amount of money that schools have been spending on non-means tested scholarships has been going down and down, in order that the amount they spend on means tested bursaries can go up and up. The scholarships will always be clearly defined on the school website. With bursaries, it's often not so clear. The Independent Schools Council website has quite a good summary for many schools, but the difficulty with bursaries is that schools often will not say how much or what scale of bursary they're going to be giving in any one year. I mean, it ranges actually. There are some schools which have a very clear description, but many don't have a clear description. And you've just got to ask. You must be brave. There are a lot of parents who feel that it's somehow shaming to ask about bursaries, but they're wrong, because schools these days want to give bursaries if they can. I mean, they want to widen the range of the type of children they take as wide as they can. And so it is essential that schools ask the admissions department of any schools they're interested in, what are the bursary provision, at what time do I have to apply? Can I get some form of assessment before I apply? All of these sort of questions need to be asked. Parents should not hold back.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And of course, as chairman of the Independent Schools Council, this question really should be very easy to answer in 1 minute. How do you get into these wonderful schools? What's the secret?
Good question. Yeah, so, okay, so there are 2 or 3 tips. First of all, you've got to apply at the right time. You know, if you want your son to go to Eton, you've got to apply by the time he's 10. You can't leave it till he's, 12 and a half. So you need to know the time scale of the application process for each school you're interested in. Secondly, you've got to be ready for the entry tests, which will normally be maths, English, maybe verbal and non-verbal reasoning. And that means that you've got to practice those tests. And you can practice them. You know, you can have a tutor, or you can go to Smith's and buy copies of verbal and non-verbal reasoning tests, but you'd be mad not to practice them. Thirdly, you've got to think about the interview which your child is likely to have, shaking hands, being smiley and nice, not too stressed, being able to talk about the books you've read, the holidays you've been on, what your interests are, things which align with the school that you're applying to. So, those are the 3 things that you've got to have done to, in common with probably most other parents, ensure that your child has a half decent chance.
Do you think too much tutoring goes on?
Yeah, I think a lot of tutoring is unnecessary. I think it's, you're in danger of cramming your child into a school, increasing their stress. I think that I would say, a modest amount of preparation using maths, English, verbal and non-verbal reasoning is sensible, but a lot of tutoring, quite unnecessary.
Very interesting. And then I think just a final question. It's not quite in any sort of sequence, but it's right. So talked about, and it really is a crux of a decision that so many parents have to make. Single sex or co-ed. Well, clearly there are advantages of co-educational schools. You were a great advocate of co-education. I think when you were at Highgate, you were a great advocate of single sex schooling when you were at Harrow. But what's the advantage of single sex? Why would you put your girl in a girls' as you did? Why would you do that rather than put them in a co-educational school?
Okay, I wasn't ever a great advocate of co-ed, but all the schools I taught in were single sex. But I've already said on this call that I don't think there's a great difference in standards between single sex and co-ed schools. I think that you're asking me the straight question, what is the advantage of a single sex school, particularly for girls? And I think there's a straight answer to that. First of all, in a single sex school, you're not having to worry about boys. Secondly, there are more leadership opportunities in and outside the classroom for girls in single sex girls' schools than there are in co-ed schools. Thirdly, there's abundant evidence that children are more likely to choose certain GCSE and A-level subjects on the basis of their gender in co-ed schools than in single-sex schools. Or to put it another way, girls are much more likely to choose science in single-sex schools than in co-ed schools. Boys are much more likely to choose English or French in a single-sex school than a co-ed school. So those are the arguments. But I would still say, I would never put this anywhere near the top of my list of criteria for selecting a school. If you live in London, let's say, you've got a whole stack of brilliant Girls' Day School Trust girls' schools there. They get wonderful results. The girls are very happy, and why wouldn't you choose those schools? And I think to not choose one of those schools because you think it would be nice for my daughter to be with boys would, I think, just be a mistake.
Very interesting. Very unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up there, Barnaby. As I said at the beginning, you got this great clarity of thought. A couple of things, but it's just a shame that some of those boys you taught at Eton in the 1980s and 70s are now running the country don't have it, and maybe that's a failure you might want to look at as the years go by. But thank you very much indeed, Barnaby. Just by the way, what's your next book on?
My next book is on what makes a good teacher.
Good, excellent. And we'll circulate some of the information about those books, because they're really great things to read. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you so much, Barnaby. We're deeply appreciative, as always, for your time, and most instructive. Thank you.
Pleasure.